Yes.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, welcome to Karen and Paul. Um, Thank you for allowing me into your home.
Well,
And
You're quite welcome.
thank you. Karen, if we can start with you. You were born in Akron, Ohio.
yes.
And can you talk us through your religious life at that time? Because I know you entered the monastery later on, but did you have a traditional Catholic background? How would you describe your early religious life?
Oh, growing up, I grew up in a very Catholic home. I had two uncles who were both priests, my mother's brother and my father's brother, and in fact, they're the ones that introduced my parents.
Well,
So they always took a particular interest in our family. I was the oldest of four. I have a sister and two younger brothers. And we grew up in Kent, Ohio, for the most part. Went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, and then at 17, I entered the Poor Clare Monastery, also in northeastern Ohio.
right. So was it? Would you call it a traditional Catholic upbringing? How
Oh,
did you do it because it was expected of you? Were you really enthusiastic about it? Or
oh, it was my choice
yeah,
and did not entirely please my family. When I was senior in high school, I had earned a scholarship, which would have paid my college. But I had already made up my mind that I was going to enter the Poor Clares, and so I turned it down, which of course did not please very many people.
right. So quite an early time in your life, you were maybe attracted to the solitude. I'm just leading up to talking about hermits and how you got
Yes.
into that. Did you develop your own feelings about how you wanted your religion to progress, or as I say, you went into the monastery? Was that a major event in your life, or just a progression from what you'd been to before?
Um, I had grown up with the idea that I would become a nun
Hmm.
when I graduated, but I wasn't attracted to the teaching or to the nursing or the other social work that the religious women were doing. I was just very strongly attracted to the focus on prayer.
Hmm.
And a cloistered monastery is a group of women who live within a walled in area. Ours was about 15 acres. And our focus was on prayer. We did not have an apostolate outside of the monastery. So our community had perpetual adoration, which meant that there was a nun in the monastery chapel for 24 hours, day and night. We were assigned to our times, and we took them. During the night was a particularly beautiful time to pray.
Hmm.
We would be assigned to our. We knew when we would be assigned, and you'd have 2 hours in the deep, deep quiet. It was a almost you would almost call it a romantic period,
Yeah.
praying like that. And we were very much aware of the world around us. And I think one of the reasons I entered the monastery was because I wanted to serve the whole world, not a particular limited portion of it, as I saw the sisters doing when they were teaching a group of children. But the prayer life that we cultivated in the monastery more or less made us aware of the what was going on throughout the entire world, although we weren't in touch with the news, except for the major things.
Right. So after many years there, you received permission to live as a hermit. What led to that decision? Was that your conscious choice, or?
Oh, that definitely,
Yeah.
again, that
Yeah.
was my choice, not those around me.
Right.
Now, people sometimes think that when you're in a monastery, you're living a very silent, solitary life. And the truth is, there is somebody at your elbow day and practically night, if you're also praying with them. You work with them, you pray with them, you play with them. Everything is done with somebody nearby. And I had reached the point where I craved being alone. I really needed solitude. And this is not unusual for people in monastic life. But they never recommend people going into solitude unless they've had the experience of sometimes 10, 15, 20 years in a community life, so that you've proved your stability and you've proved your devotion, and you're ready to then be able to keep on with your own schedule, and you're out of your own inner strength.
So there appears to be a lot of misconceptions in the outer community about the hermit's life, and obviously you've gone a long way to addressing that with your organisation. So I want to try and bring Paul up to the same time in life. So if I can talk to you, Paul, you were born just outside Boston?
Yes.
And raised in a French-Canadian community. Did you also have a traditional Catholic upbringing, a family up to a certain stage?
Yeah, extremely traditional. There were a number of religious women in my family, among my grandparents' generation, and I had an uncle. My mother's brother was also a Catholic priest, and I think that probably from the time I was 5 years old, there was this conscious effort on the part of the entire extended family to make certain that I would prepare for the priesthood someday.
Right.
They practically had me ordained before I got into elementary school.
Yeah, so at what stage of your life were you ordained a priest? Was that?
I was ordained in 1978 after having completed my undergraduate work at Boston College, and then my graduate work for my master's degree in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And it had been a preparation with its ups and downs, but I had finally settled on becoming a member of a domestic missionary group called the Glenmary Home Missioners, and who were dedicated to working with the poor and working in areas that are very, very marginally Catholic in the United States, the Deep South and what we call the Appalachian Mountains.
Right. So at some stage after that, you left the community and moved to North Carolina. What led to that? Was that a natural progression, or was that circumstances?
No, I think there was, after an initial period of enthusiasm in preparing for Roman Catholic ministry, especially I was pretty much begun my preparation and did my early ministerial work in the full flush of the time of the Second Vatican Council, and the whole progressive agenda of the Church seemed to be on the ascendancy, and which made me very enthusiastic and everything else. But right about the time I was ordained, what we began to see as what we call the restoration had begun, and kind of a very major backtracking, conservative backtracking on the Second Vatican Council. And it was very disillusioning for me, and I became more and more disaffected with the work that I was required to do, and the kinds of disciplines and doctrines that I was having to preach, and disciplines that I was having to both observe and ask other people to observe as well, to the point where I really felt that I needed to step out of regular ministry and ask for a leave of absence at that time.
Right, okay. While we're on the subject of religion, I wanted to ask something. I struggle sometimes with definitions, and obviously a lot of people talk about God, and I think I might have briefly mentioned to you before, had a traditional, what's called a Church of England background up till about 17. And I think I maybe had an aversion to religion for some time, but I'm okay with that now. But when someone asked me, David, do you believe in God? I would have to say, what do you mean by God? I mean, some people may think that you shouldn't ask that question, but it's in my heart. So can I ask you both, what is your definition of God? What does God mean to you?
Would you like Karen to go first?
Yeah,
or
sure.
me?
Yeah. Karen?
Well, as you said, that's an extraordinarily difficult question.
Yeah.
Easy to ask, but hard to answer.
Mm.
God, for me, is the source that sustains all life.
Mm.
So, and is a personal being. Beyond that, I don't know what more can be said.
Yeah.
I feel a very strong relationship, personal relationship, with this being, and it's the focus of my life.
Mm.
But to describe more what that is,
Yeah, it's an impossible question, really, isn't it?
uh-huh.
How do you feel, Kevin, about that? Is that you have a similar? It's
I've begun over the last probably, I don't know, maybe 8 to 10 years, in my own way of putting it together within my heart and in my mind. God is not so much someone who as what happens when.
yeah,
And I find that that ultimate source of life energy is something that can be recognized in a lot of events and in a lot of activities to try to further that conception of God that, albeit changed as you mature from a child, but although I would admit and agree with Karen that for me God is very personal, but God is not really a being. God is being itself.
right.
And beyond that, it gets, we all get tongue-tied.
Yeah, exactly. It's I can't help but ask the question, but it's something that to me it's what you do with your life, what you call the being or the universe or the spirit, as Native Americans say. Isn't that relevant to me? What the name you put on it? It's what you feel in your heart.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that brings us to talking about the hermitic life, and maybe if you can tell us about what led to the formation of Ravensbread. What was the early? Was it something that occurred to you gradually? Was it sudden? How did that start?
Well, a Dominican priest who had lived as a hermit himself for some years in South Africa, when he came back to the States, he wasn't allowed to continue as a hermit, but he knew there were people, this was back in the 1980s, people who in this country who were beginning to move into hermit life. Maybe I should say this. Hermit life had fallen out of popularity for many, many years, centuries. But when the culture in the world makes a significant shift, which began after the 1950s, then there is often a revival of hermit life. Partly, I think, because the hermits are the people who are like the hub of the wheel. The wheel is the world, the rim is a world which is spinning around faster and faster. You need a stronger hub to hold it together. And that's what hermits do by their focus, their intense focus on divine, on the divine, on the sacred. And that had been my experience after 6 years living as a hermit in West Virginia. And during that time, I got this newsletter that the Dominican priest had started to circulate. And when his assignment was changed, Paul and I were asked if we would be willing to take over the newsletter. It had about 180 readers at that time. And Paul had had experience with publishing a magazine. I'm a writer. It seemed an ideal fit. So we said yes, we would do this. This was 1997, and we looked at the newsletter. It was very small, and we changed the format to make it into an 8-page newsletter, and decided that for the most part it was going to be written by the readers themselves. We would set up a topic and ask our readers to address it. And over the years, it's been over 13 now, the newsletter has continued to grow. We have over 1,100 readers that are getting it by snail mail, and then we also get about 500 hits a day on our website, where the newsletter is also available.
So has it exceeded your expectations, or what expectation did you have?
Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's we've done in a way. No, there's never been paid advertising for the newsletter ever. The publicity that's come from the newsletter has come from outside media sources who have interviewed us, and in the context of mentioning the newsletter, it received some publicity in other media outlets, and so other people learned of it. But the great joy for Karen and I has been that it has really truly been and remains a forum of exchange by hermits themselves, hermits and religious solitaries, whether they actually call themselves hermits, whether they're looking at ways of living out eremitic life in this day and age, which can be in an apartment in New York, it can be on a farm in Colorado, it can be in a suburb in Philadelphia. It doesn't really. People are trying to look at the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the whole experience of eremiticism, and see how can we live silence, solitude, and simplicity in the context of our own lives, with more or less with the cards that we've been handed.
Yeah.
And some people are married, some people are single, not by choice, some people are invalids, some people are prisoners serving life sentences in solitary confinement. A variety of situations where people have decided to be intentional about it, and it's their forum. The newsletter is their forum of exchange of their experience in this, and this is what gives us the greatest joy.
Sure, I mean that's the amount of people you reach is amazing. But you're talking about the prisons, so they must have heard about it from someone, and more people. They've introduced you to more people, and that's
some people wrote to us and asked or said, "I have a friend in prison who has found God, and I think would benefit by reading your newsletter." And we don't say that people have to give a donation for it, but some people, we ask a small amount if they can, and if people want to give a little extra to cover it for someone else, the newsletter is always paid for itself.
Yeah.
We've never had to put what you would say our money into it. It's somehow God has been at work there.
Yeah, you've obviously tapped into something very profound, and you are literally worldwide.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
I'm looking at the latest edition of Ravensbread as someone from New South Wales, Australia, Eugene, and I love some of the terminology. He says, "My place in the church is as a secular priest and ordained layman." I love that. It's unconventional, but it's how it's speaking from the heart, and it's a great way of describing something that's unconventional but still very profound and so worthwhile to many people. So how do you see Ravensbread going? Do you just say this is how it is and we'll see? Do you have any plans for it, or how to reach more?
Well, we looked at Ravensbread and thought of what do these people need? What would help them? So it's expanded into a real ministry. One of the things that people need are writings about the hermit life, and so we offer what we call resources. They're either articles that have been written and published, they're hard for people to get a hold of, among the Catholic hermits, there is an option of becoming um, recognized by
by
the
the
church.
institution.
Yeah.
Place was made for that during the Second Vatican Council. Some people argued rather persuasively for reintroducing that into the legal structures of the institution.
Right.
And so now a person has the option, if they meet the requirements set out by the law, by the canon law of the church, of being formally recognized as a hermit, as a consecrated hermit in the church. Most of our readers are not. Obviously, the readers who are not Catholic, do not practice the Catholic faith, or are not even Christians, are either Buddhists or Sikhs or Sunnis, whatever, Sufis. I mean, they, obviously that's not their primary interest, and yet they do have an awful lot of interest in the writings of the Desert Fathers, the Desert Mothers from the 4th century, the 5th century, during the earliest beginnings of what we call hermit life today in the West.
There have been people who have done surveys. We make make available to them surveys about hermit life, how to, if they wanted to become recognized by the church, we make that information available to them. The other things we do for them is to offer them the option of making a retreat here at our house, which is on a mountainside in the Smokies, and you don't see another house from our deck. And so we have a small hermitage available for people who want to come here for solitude and silence. And we also offer people the option of what is known as spiritual guidance or spiritual direction. Usually Paul's working away from the house, so I'm the one that's usually doing that. It's often done by phone and occasionally by Skype.
Right, so after Ravensbed, obviously writing is a great part of your life. At what stage in your life did you feel like you wanted to be a writer? What inspired you to do that?
I think that was shortly after she emerged from the womb.
Okay.
Now, I knew I was a writer before I went into the monastery. Didn't know if I'd have the option to do it once I was there. But after about 7 years, suddenly I couldn't stop. I couldn't not write, and I began writing poetry. I began writing articles about my experiences in the monastery, and those were published. Eventually, our group was Poor Clares, which is the women's branch of the Franciscans. And I know Father Sean is very familiar with them.
Yeah.
So we were asked to look at the beginnings of our life, our spirituality. And I did that by writing a biography of St. Clare, which a lot of new studies had just come out, so I was able to do that. And it's published again, it's available.
Right.
When I was living as a hermit, I wrote about my experiences as a hermit, where God begins to be. And that book is still circulating. I get letters from people who are reading that. After Paul and I were married, we did some co-authoring. We wrote a book on the hermit life, which called Consider the Ravens, on contemporary hermit life, in which we collected a lot of the information we had acquired while ministering to hermits. And then people who had read my book, which I had written while living in West Virginia as a hermit, wanted to know how I got from there to where I am now. So I just brought out a new book called Where God is Ever Found, From Cloister to Couple, A Woman's Autumn Journey. And that's just come out.
Right, I know that once I've read your books, hopefully we can do a separate interview and go into detail, because I'm really looking forward to reading them and sharing that with you at length. Because, right, do you think it appears that Are you born to be a writer? I mean, it's something I would like to do, but I don't have it in me. That's just it. I just don't have it in me. Can
Yeah.
people be taught, or obviously there needs to be some natural ability or inclination?
I think it's very much a gift. You know, some people are artists, painters, some people are dancers, and we all might admire it, but I couldn't be a dancer even if I really worked at it. But I can be a writer. That's that, like you say, that's in me.
Yeah.
I think there is something about writers. I'm not sure. I think it might be with some of the other fine arts that we know, but the one thing that I keep hearing over and over again, and of course I've definitely heard it living with Karen, is that a writer cannot not write. They just cannot not do that. They have to write. There's almost an inner compulsion to have to do that, and I've just watched Karen over the last 16, 17 years that we've been together, and a day without writing is definitely a day without sunshine.
Right.
Even if it's just email.
Right. So does a book come to you in stages, Karen? Do you have an idea and it just you have the initial idea and then it just moves on from there? The thoughts come to you naturally?
Yes, they do, but it's never easy. One way you can say, I'm a writer, so writing is easy for me. That's not true. I'm a writer and I must write, but I struggle to write in a way that feels beautiful and right to me. And the topics that I write on, like you say, they'll come to me, but only initially. And it's in the process of writing it that the topic develops.
Right. That's interesting. And Paul, you've spent a lot of time in community mental health, and I think that's one of the things, to some extent, the interest. I work for a mental health organisation. What brought you to that? Was it something, it just happened, or did you have an opportunity and it grew on you from there? Or, 'cause I'm very interested in that field.
It's interesting you should say that. It's sort of like looking at one's options. I really never wanted to do anything except ministry in my life. I looked at a variety of other things early on when I was young in school, but I really felt drawn to doing ministry and felt that really is what I wanted to give my life to. When I felt conscientiously that I could no longer work as in the Roman Catholic clergy, when I felt that was no longer an option for me that I could live with, nevertheless, I still took very seriously the commitment I had made in 1978, where I did promise and took an oath. Now, I received a rescript from that oath, or an indult if you want, but I felt that I had committed myself to serving the peoples of these areas, and in fact the area that Karen and I have come to settle in, and to serve their spiritual needs. And I wanted, as best I could, to continue doing that. That's one of the reasons we settled in this county, because it was one of the poorest and most underdeveloped counties in North Carolina. And I looked for some way that I could, as closely as possible, continue to do ministry, benefit people's overall emotional, spiritual, psychological health. And the only things that were really open to me was working for the mental health system here, or mental health services that worked here in this county. And so I got involved first by working with people with developmental disabilities, and later by transitioning over to people with mental health and substance abuse problems.
Right.
But I always, in all of my work, as I was not trained as a social worker, I sort of, as they call it these days, grandfathered into those positions. But nevertheless, with the counseling skills that I did have, and the concern that I did have for people's overall, the development and the maintenance of their overall health, and just having a whole integrated view of, intellectual health and emotional health and psychological health and spiritual health, that we're all of a piece. It all goes together. And when one part suffers, other parts suffer as well.
Yeah.
And I felt that, well, this was a way that I could, in a sense, continue to minister among the least, especially among the poorest of the population here in this county.
Right. Well, certainly in this country, there's a lot of misconceptions about mental health. And actually, today I was the word went round that they were having a lecture, but a discussion on men's mental health. They just wanted to speak to men because, in their opinions, men, maybe it's an image thing. They bottle things up. Women, generally speaking, they share more. And I found it very interesting because it's something that there's a lot of misunderstanding about. And people can be helped back into the community. They can lead normal lives. It's not a life sentence, if you will.
Yeah.
And I think it's great that people are working so hard towards changing society's attitude. And there is a lot of misunderstanding, but as more of us maybe give these messages out about it's an illness that can be treated. And I got so much admiration for people that work in that field. Colleagues of mine, in mental health wards, and it's something I hope we're making some progress on. I think is it a similar situation in the States where there's this attitude that people like yourself and others in the profession are trying to break down and tell people what the real situation is.
Yeah, there is still a lot of stigma, social stigma attached to having mental illness of whatever kind. And of course, among men and among the male population, that whole emotional component of not having that strong, silent, together kind of, whereas the women, it's permissible to have a strong emotional life, but with men it's not. There's still much of that same kind of thing. What many of us are struggling with right now, and I don't know how it's experienced in the United Kingdom, but is that a lot of mental health is moving, or a very strong component of mental health is moving in the direction and becoming identified almost exclusively with pharmacology. And so that, health is in a pill bottle. And although there are some very effective, thank goodness, medications that have come out to help people manage the symptoms of serious and persistent mental illness, too many people, whether it's anxiety or some other form of perceptual mental problems that they have, think that medication are beginning to be led to believe, whether by media or by the pharmacology, the industry of pharmaceuticals, that their health is in a pill bottle. And although that's a very definite component, there are so many other aspects of one's life, and that's what many of us are very concerned about, that people also pay attention to their nutrition, their sleep, their activity, their habits, their beliefs, their perceptions, that all of these things, the balance that they have between work and study and prayer and relaxation in life, that all of these things contribute, their social surroundings, to a healthy mental life. That is a very big challenge for us today.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing what you do in that way. I'd like to move to talk about your community. We had a conversation a few days ago. We were talking about Native American people and the wide circle of people that live not far from you. How would you describe your community outside your house and the people you associate with? Native American, as you know, that's a subject that's very dear to my heart. And people, Native American people. How would you describe your community, the people that live around there?
We're in a section of the Smoky Mountains that is rural and not very well known, which is fine with us. It's an area where the Cherokee originally lived and had for over 1,000 years, I believe. They were back in here. When the white people came, they gradually pushed them, made agreements with them, which they didn't keep, and gradually brought them to the point where they marched them across the country along what we know as the Trail of Tears.
Mm.
But there were a number of the Cherokee who hid out in these mountains, which are very, very extensive around, and remained here. And they're known as the Eastern Band of Cherokee. And their place, what's known as the Qualla Boundary is the area which is theirs, and it's outside of the United States jurisdiction. They have their own jurisdiction over their own lives there.
Right.
And what many of the Native Americans have done in order to earn money is that their laws allow them to have gambling, and unfortunately that's what the Cherokee have done. There's a huge gambling place on their boundary now, but it is bringing in money for them. They were living at extremely low level before, and gradually they're beginning to be able to
have a better educational system and a lot more, medical care and housing and a lot of those things. Unfortunately, I mean, you can look at it a number of ways. The gambling industry brings its own set of curses, but it has brought a set of blessings for people, for many of those on the boundary who lived in extreme poverty.
Right.
What's fascinating to go there now, they're reviving their own culture. And all the street signs, the Cherokee were one of the very few that had their own written language. And they now have their street signs written in Cherokee, as well as in English. And they're teaching their children from first grade up to speak Cherokee and to revive their own language, their own dances, their own spirituality. In fact, a friend of ours is going to be working with them for 5 days next week as they explore their own Cherokee spirituality.
That's wonderful. How responsive are they to people outside their community? Are they welcoming, or does it depend on who the person is?
Oh, very, very. For one thing, the Qualla Boundary and the community of Cherokee itself right now is a huge, huge tourist attraction. I mean, there are people, because it's set right near the Appalachian Trail, it's right in the Smoky Mountains, which is a huge tourist draw here in the United States. Well, I mean, throughout the world, but they are host to, and so they're a very hospitable people, and they have the recreation of one of the original villages is right there, where they take a lot of people on educational tours, and it's almost like if you've ever visited the United States and been to Plymouth Plantation to see the 17th century, English pilgrims' recreation of that settlement. Well, this is somewhat the same kind of thing, but it's of a 17th century, or I should say 18th century Cherokee settlement.
Yeah.
And where they teach the people that are visiting there all about the native way of life that they lived in those days.
Yeah,
and they're, they were especially noted for their basket weaving, which is fantastic. They also do beautiful jewelry. They also have their own songs, their own dances. They put on, throughout the summer months, an outdoor program every night, which is based on their own legends and on their own.
They have one very spectacular play that's held in an amphitheater every summer season. I think it begins in late May, and it goes all the way to what here in the United States is Labor Day, around the beginning of September, and it's a play entitled "Unto These Hills," and it's the story of just the history of their people from the time of the European colonization until the time when the Trail of Tears began.
Yeah.
So it's a very powerful drama, and it draws thousands and thousands of people every season.
Yeah. I mean, they obviously had some terrible things done to them many, many years ago. Are they? And there's, you can understand bitterness, but it's encouraging that they're reaching out to other communities. Is that something they've learnt to live with, or maybe that's in the background, but they can get on with their lives? And
I think so. I think for the most part, it's an amazing thing. But, obviously, all of the Native American peoples here in the United States have had to make a tremendous accommodation. And I think the majority of those groups, tribes that are prospering, it's because they realize that, to carry the bitterness, to carry the hatred, the anger, the whatever, it will not serve them well. Now, surely, yes, there's some sadness and some depression, and I'm sure there's some residual anger and resentment. But for the most part, the Native Americans that I've talked to have said to dwell on that and to vocalize that and express that is not going to get us anywhere.
Sure. I mean, there's so much we can learn, and as you know, I spent some time in Australia, and I'm very interested in Indigenous people, and a lot of similarities between what you've said with the Native Americans and the Aboriginals, where in the early days, certainly the British government and the American government, they had this attitude towards them that, oh, heathens and savages, a dreadful attitude. But I found from my own experience how much these people can teach us. They have a just wonderful affinity with the land and a help. There might be people that have no money, but if you come to stay with them, they'll move out of where they are. They'll accommodate. It's a very giving and a relationship with nature that I found absolutely wonderful. So the early days when that awful attitude, the reverse is the case. We can learn from them, and we can all learn from each other.
Exactly, David. And there's a lot more being done now. I remember when Karen and I first moved to this area, how delighted I was to see and continue to see the growing influence, whether it be seminars, webinars, conferences, throughout this whole area that are devoted to traditional teachings, that are devoted to the recovery and the appreciation and the making the acquaintance of, making knowledgeable the traditional teachings of the Native Americans to the Anglo population, to the non-native population.
Right. I wonder what the response would be if someone approached them and said, something, what I'm doing here, would they be interested in doing a forum like this, or is that possible at all? It's something I'd love to attempt
there's
to
some
do.
of that, yes, and there's some of that already going on. There's a lot of that going on right here, whether it's going on between here and Europe or between here and England, that I don't know, but I do know that right around here, they're utilizing all of the means, whether it's Skype or some of the other local TV things or whatever. A lot of that is happening already.
Yeah, they have websites and other ways in which people could learn to know more about them, and we could maybe publicize that and maybe have a Skype chat with some of them at some stage. I would love that. I don't know how possible it is, but I would hope that that's possible.
Well, we're friends with a number of people over there in Cherokee, and one woman in particular, she had worked so long and so hard with the tribe that they inducted her into the tribe as a member, so that she has all the privileges that the Cherokees do.
Yeah.
And that is rare. That is rare. They're in ways, like Paul said, they are very hospitable and they're very welcoming. But there is a certain amount of their life and their beliefs that they don't share freely with anybody.
Yeah, I can
That's
understand. Yeah.
kept very quiet, very, very deep within them.
Yeah.
Also, too, there is a sense, and when you get to really know Native Americans, again, when one doesn't want to overgeneralize too much or anything like that, but what I have found as well is while there is no overt hostility or bitterness or any of that, but Native Americans are not easily persuaded
Yeah.
by the quote-unquote largesse of the white population. They know that they've been taken for granted. They know that they've been exploited. They really look very, very carefully, and they take with more than a grain of salt all of the public statements of how the whites have made restitution and how we've been great about it and everything else. And while they're not going to dispute that in public or anything like that, they're not taken in by that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That does not go down well with the native population.
Yeah, well, obviously, I need to respect their privacy, but maybe we can exchange some links or make them available to people if they're interested in gaining more knowledge, because I think that's so important these days. I mean, a variety of all faiths, Mormon people, Jewish people. Yeah, I'd love to reach out and try and connect to them. So I'll just see what I can do on the internet. And
We'll do what we can.
thank you. It's something. I mean, I suppose we all want to make a difference in our life in our own way, and we all have very unique ways of doing that, and to do something that helps maybe other generations or younger generations to be more understanding and responsive, because prejudice probably has always been around. There will be a degree of prejudice. It's part of society, but I think in small ways.
David, one thing that I would want to mention during this particular time right now, I think one of the things that not only recovering some of my own background, my own personal background, but becoming more and more familiar with Native American teaching and the whole Native American experience, as opposed, in contrast to the Caucasian or the European experiences, we are so good at making distinctions. We excel at making distinctions. It's part of the way we perceive the world. It's part of the way that we advance and do our human project. Whereas the Native Americans seem to me far, far better, not at seeing the distinctions, but seeing the relations and honoring the relatedness of all things. They can see relationship where we have a hard time getting beyond the distinctions.
Yeah.
And that's one of, not the only for sure, but that's one of the great, great spiritual contributions, because that has the power to change the whole way we perceive our interactions with one another and our interactions with the greater environment, the wider environment. Yeah. If one can begin to see the relatedness as opposed to the distinctions, it just puts everything on a different footing.
Oh, it certainly does. That's right. It's I suppose everyone needs to just search their own hearts, don't they, for what they can do and try and influence other people to do. And
I have a saying here.
One of their phrases that they end all their letters with and everything is, "And to all our relations." It's a living thing. It's always with you.
Yeah. This is something that this small plaque I keep with me at my workplace, and I always hesitate to just say it by heart because it's just so well done. But Chief Seattle is the author of this, and he had said, "Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. all things are bound together, all things connect.
Wow, wonderful words. Absolutely.
Whether we're talking about the World Wide Web of technology, or we're talking about the web of the organic web of life itself, I think the same holds true. And I think, that's a great example of the kind of gift, that whole gift of being able to recognize and honor relationships.
Right. And we talk. I mean, we're not quite at the end yet. Maybe not far away, but hopefully soon you're going to be on live stream once we've got the technical problems sorted out. And what are your thoughts on what you would like to do with that?
Well, we would definitely like to say more about the hermit life, make that more available, just more understood. And then, of course, I would like to advertise my books, which is a necessity for us. But Paul and I are both very deeply religious people, and I know that Brother Sean would had intimated that he would like us to do some of his prayer sessions.
It's wonderful the way some of these things work, because, well, I hesitate to say by chance, but something that happened a couple of years ago. I'd known Sean for quite a few years, but for some reason we just lost contact, and then suddenly he said, "Oh, we're having a get-together at my place, and would you like to come over?" Which I did, and out of that came live stream. And after one event, the chain reaction is amazing, because I'm involved in this live stream and YouTube stuff, and it's potential for it to reach people. I mean, I only know about you initially because of Miriam in New Zealand.
In New Zealand, yes.
And it's fantastic how, I mean, you can't get further away from New Zealand. Some people say if you go past it, you're on the way back. It's just
exactly.
Amazing. So, it's literally worldwide, and here we are today, and who knows what can happen once like-minded people get together with good intentions to make a difference in the world, and to make the world a better place. So,
well, I think that's what hermits are here for. The hermit life is not a selfish life. It's a life that.
And I think sometimes too, when people hear the word hermit, of course, it's taken on some rather wild connotations.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's more of a caricature than anything else.
Yeah.
And of course it's been used by the press and by the media at times in association with some rather bizarre personal characteristics, personalities, people who are truly dangerous, in fact, And I think part of what we can do is to kind of, in a popular way, in a way that's not very academic, in a way that's not very, difficult to understand, is to kind of present more or less the essential features of what we're talking about when we're talking about the lives of religious solitaries and why they do what they do, and what are really the features of their lives, and get away from this wild individual emerging from a cave in the mountains, full of hair and unwashed and unclean and, littered with vermin and, all of that. That's not necessarily the only picture of a hermit.
So it's great that we're sort of combining to change attitudes like that, because there are a lot, and it takes a lot of breaking down. But I think I've talked about my building blocks approach before, where you chip away a little bit by bit, and you do make a difference over time. So I look forward to doing more of that. And
I think one other feature that I think we would like to contribute to is, we know a lot of people today. It's funny, because I said to Karen, I said, here I am in the middle of the mountains of North Carolina. Here I am, a Catholic priest who's not really recognized in the clergy anymore and is not really functioning as a clergyman, and yet I find used to be Catholics under just about every rock I turn here. But I talk to more people, more and more, and I'm seeing this corroborated in large national and international studies, where more and more people identify themselves as spiritual but not religious, or religious but not denominational.
Yeah.
And to be able to offer something about contemplative prayer to people who say, well, I'm not an Episcopalian or an Anglican, or I'm not a Lutheran, or I used to be Catholic, but I don't want the church anymore. But there's still very much a deep spiritual need and a hunger and a desire to pray.
Yeah.
And I think contemplative prayer has a place in everybody's prayer life, however one conceives of their prayers.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's part of that discussion that Karen and I can contribute to as well.
Because obviously there are misunderstandings on both sides, and the more we can do to break those down, the better the world is going to be. So I know we could talk for hours and hours. I'm sure we could very easily, but maybe we'll bring it to a close for now. I'd like to do this again very soon, because there's lots more subjects we can move into, and the books especially are, in depth on that. So thank you so much for being with us today. I've really enjoyed this interview.
Thank you for having us.
And I look very much forward to the next one and continuing this international community friendship that we have and spreading the world around. Thank you for your time, and goodbye for now.
Goodbye for now. Thank you.
God bless you.